Hello, and welcome to this online panel organized by the Malcolm H. Kerr Center for Middle East Center in Beirut, Lebanon, in which we'll be discussing the challenges of debt and austerity facing Middle East countries ahead of the Marrakech meetings of the International Monetary Fund. With us today will be Ziad Bahaa-El Din, former Egyptian Deputy Prime Minister, who will be joining us shortly. We have Niranjan Sarangi, senior economist at the Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia, and also Ayadi, founder and president of the Euro-Mediterranean Economists Association. I'm going to jump straight in because we have limited time, a mass of questions, a mass of considerations, challenges to consider. And so I'm going to go straight to Niranjan Sarangi with the following question, that the Middle East and North Africa region has been undergoing periods of drought, poor harvests, and more recently, as we saw dramatically in Morocco with the earthquake and in Libya with Storm Daniel, series of natural disasters as well, compounding the challenges. So the question here to you is, how do you see the way in which high debt burdens specifically additionally challenge Middle East countries in addressing food and climate change concerns? And moreover, has engagement with the International Monetary Fund helped these countries to make progress in moving ahead on climate mitigation and adaptation policies and remedies?
Thank you, Carnegie. Thank you, Mr. Azid. It's a pleasure to be in the panel. I think your question is very pertinent. The Arab region, I mean, when we say Arab region, MENA region, if I may say Arab region, ESCO works for the Arab states. If I say Arab states, the Arab states is very diverse. It has oil importers and oil exporters, so the food and energy crisis impact differently different countries. But we're talking about mainly the oil importers. The challenge is for them, and the oil importers are also food importers. So, for example, in 2022, with the rising food prices and energy prices, they are the net losers. Like something like they lose $7 billion in aggregate from the GDP. Among the countries, these rising food prices, I mean, of course, impact them, but these countries are also highly debt burdened. Lebanon has defaulted in 2020. Other countries, the middle income countries, hold about their debt is like 82% of the GDP. And the debt service burden for some countries is above 50% of the revenues that they collect. So obviously, that amount that could have been spent on essential public services is consumed for debt service. On the food security, I mean, the region is also highly food insecure, particularly those who depend on food imports. And it's a statistics that I may say that about 35% of the Arab population are food insecure, as is estimated in the latest report. That to 12 million more people are added to food insecurity in the last 1 year. On the climate change, the climate finance flows to the Arab region falls severely short of the needs as per the nationally determined contributions estimates, and that too for only for 11 countries in the region. It's not easy to have estimates for all countries. Some countries have done it, some countries have not. But according to the estimates, it's like 570 billion that's required until 2030. What the Arab region has received is like 34.5 billion. In other words, it's something like 6% of what they need. So there is a significant need that is falls short of for addressing climate needs. On debt overall, the point is not only that the debt is increasing for the climate finance, the finance that the region is receiving more in terms of debt than in terms of grants. The ESCO brief on climate finance shows that the debt is more than 7 times than the grants. So grants are something like 4 billion as compared to debt in 30 billion. On top of that, the concessional share of the debt is reducing consistently for the climate finance. Also, in general, the concessional share of debt is reducing, primarily from the multilateral development banks, also from the bilateral creditors. So overall official creditors' share of concessional debt is shrinking. So in this situation, while the debt service burden is high and the concessional share of debt is reducing, often countries are relying on borrowing from the market. And currently, the high interest rate is increasing that burden because the cost of refinancing is high. And on top of these challenges, so the overall, the SDG financing gaps are getting bigger and bigger. And of course, COVID-19 impacted it severely. But the scenario shows that the debt distress and also the fiscal risks are going to stay for some time, in particularly for the low and middle income countries in the region.
Thanks very much. And actually, you ended on a perfect note for me to turn to Ziad Bahaa-El Din, who's just joined us. Thanks. With a question where I want to take this forward, which is what you ended, Niranjan, on how things like COVID-19, the pandemic, and of course the Ukraine war, how these things have come as very adverse external shocks. And the question I want to put to you is, Ziad, that clearly this has affected debt sustainability in Middle East countries, although there's also a feeling that until the Ukraine war, this situation was relatively manageable. Do you agree with that? But more importantly, what do you see as the balance between the impact of these external shocks on the one side and on the other side, key structural weaknesses in these various countries of Middle East, North Africa, that have contributed to the debt sustainability challenge, and maybe with particular reference to Egypt?
Sure. Well, thank you very much for inviting me on this panel, and it's a pleasure to see you, Yazid, after such a long time. Well, it really is a big debate because, of course, if you listen to the official discourse by most countries in the region, they will put most, if not all, of the blame on the dual blows of the Ukrainian war and COVID before that. Now, let's not in any way undermine the impact that those two crises have had on our national economies. They are certainly massive. The COVID crisis impacted, obviously, the whole world. It impacted trade, investment, flows, tourism, and it was a long-term impact, and it's one from which we continue to suffer until today. And of course, the Ukrainian war was really an even bigger blow, especially to a country like Egypt, when you consider the amount of trade between us previously. And both parties to the war, Ukraine and Russia, tourism, imports of some very specific food items, oil and gas exchange. So quite massive, really massive. And that really is not something we should be, that's not the subject of the debate. The issue is whether these are alone the causes of the current crisis or not. Now, as I said, the official discourse is that everything was going fine until this double blow, and then things began to be more problematic. I think it's important to stop here and reflect a little bit and acknowledge that what you call structural weaknesses were indeed present already prior to the Russian tanks crossing the Ukrainian borders. We were already suffering from an uncertainty about the currency market. International banks reports were already speculating about outflows of foreign currency from Egypt and other countries in the region. There had already been a lot of debate and complaint about the growing role of the state in the economy, and therefore the crowding out of the private sector. And there had been discussions going on for at least 3 or 4 years about whether the level of spending on infrastructure and mega projects was sustainable, and whether the money was being put in the right place. What this means is that while the two blows of Ukraine and COVID were real and massive, as I said, but it was like a blow that comes to an already weakened body, or an already fragile body, and therefore the impact became quite as dramatic as we see it now. Let me just say that this is not an academic debate. This is not a debate about the past. It's an extremely important one, and one which we all must face realistically and with transparency. And the reason is this: because if you consider that things were going fine until COVID and Ukraine, then it is natural, or the implicit message is that this is where I would like to return to as soon as the impact of the two crises subsides. And this is what brings us to the future. It's important to have this discussion and to reach some sensible conclusions in it, because it's not about the past, it's about the future. It's about the present and the future. If we do not acknowledge the structural problems that we had, and we continue to want to go back to where we were exactly, then this is not going to be very encouraging. And I think that part of the solution going forward is going to have to acknowledge in any simple way. Nobody expects a government to come out and say, I've made mistakes, but there must be a message that we are willing to go beyond where we were before those two crises.
Many thanks, and that's a perfect segue to Reem. I'd like to put the same question to you in relation to Tunisia, and following on what we just heard from Ziad Bahaa-El Din. What are the obstacles? Is it also a question of moving towards something beyond rather than just going back to what was before?
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this panel discussion. I think this is quite timely, and also to rethink the whole debate about debt and how debt really impacts the economies in low and middle income countries. So, I mean, the specific case of Tunisia, obviously, you all know that Tunisia has been, of course, a very interesting case since what is called as Arab Spring. I think this was quite a political transition for a country that had to move into what I call uncertainties, and political uncertainties have implications also on economic uncertainties. So, so the country has been really, in a way, since 2010, going through significant shifts and learning from different governments. And this, of course, has led to economic disturbances and difficulties since 2010. Of course, in a way, the instability, or the political instability of those governments has also led to a lack of economic coherence, and also economic policies that are really anchored into what I call sustainability. So this is not only in terms of the financial sustainability, but also social sustainability and overall economic sustainability. I think this is also important to keep in mind. Now, the regional, I call it the international shocks coming from the pandemic and the Ukraine, and also other, shocks which now we are still living in terms of the climate and also the digitalization, did not help much, particularly for countries which are not prepared to face those external shocks. So that really made to the country more difficulties to move into a sustainable socioeconomic path. Also, we need to keep in mind that Tunisia if you look at the economic structure of the country, is very much dependent on European markets. And then this does not really help much, and also a country which is relying on a high portion of GDP on tourism, and there are shocks and there are political uncertainties and difficulties. So really, it hits much harder than in other countries where they are much less dependent on the geographical area and also on the specific sectors. So this is also something that needs to be taken into consideration. Now, over these years, the unemployment rate has been quite high, particularly for the youth and for women. And this has been persistent and nothing has been done about it. And this is why we see very highly skilled people migrating from the country. Now, going on the obstacles that you mentioned, the obstacles, but in my view, when there is no coherence in the economic policy of a country and there is no vision, it's very difficult to even think about. I mean, everything practically is an obstacle. And if we look also at how the economic situation of Tunisia has evolved over the past decade, it has not really modernized much. I mean, still there is a very high wage for the public sector. So the public sector is really quite, I would say, burdensome in terms of the over economic activity that we see in the country. And it's practically one of the highest over GDP worldwide. So it's also for a tiny country like Tunisia and having such a prominent public sector, this let us to think. And this is also, in a way, impacting the financial system of the country, because it's really the banking sector is tending to finance the public sector. And there is also crowding out effect overall vis-a-vis the private sector. And this does not help either. Plus, of course, the subsidies, and the debate of the subsidies is very complex and controversial, because when you have an external shock and when you are facing the social tensions in the country, this is how you could, stabilize in short term the situation. So in reality, the difficulties are in fact embedded into what I call a lack of coherence and a lack of modern economic policy for the country. And this is really leading, in fact, to just increasing the, I would say, the indebtedness of the country, not only external, but also domestic, while is not helped by the regional setting and also the difficult shocks that have been happening over the last years. And again, it's important also to mention the governance and the I would say the poor institutional quality in several aspects. And it's also important to mention the lack of transparency and sometimes very high corruption and lack of governance, I would say, dimensions, which in my view should be looked at, because this has negative implication on accountability and also on the, I would say, the confidence of the population in its policies and also its institutions. So this also very important. And last but not least, if you look at the trade situation of Tunisia with Europe, it has always been in deficit. And this is also not helping a lot the country in its transition toward a modern, I would say, democracy with sound economic policy. And this has not been dealt with in any of the governments that we've seen up to now. So in reality, the case of Tunisia is, I would say, a difficult one in the region. Tunisia is quite strategic for Europe, and we could see all the agreements that have been signed over the past, I would say, months. But my big question is, are those agreements sound? And are they really lifting this country from what I call a lack of coherence, lack of vision, into really a sound, I would say, economic future? So I agree with the previous speaker. Yes, we need to look at the future, but we need to prepare for it.
Thanks very much for that. And I'm also very grateful and happy that both of you have set up, in fact, all three of you have set up the stage for us getting deeper into the politics of this as well as the economics. So I'm going to pursue those two lines of questioning. And I've got as it were, well, I've got two questions which basically cover. I'd like to come to Ziad Bahaa-El Din to cover the politics of this, if he can, and Reem Ayadi to cover the economics, if possible, just so as to sort of be efficient in our use of time. Now, the broad sort of the background here is that we see a striking impasse in discussions between the International Monetary Fund on the one side and countries like Egypt, Tunisia, and Lebanon in addressing debt issues and development goals. Now, we could argue that there are issues, there are obstacles or blockages relating to the role of the military in the economy in Egypt, for example, privatization in Tunisia, reform of subsidy regimes, reform of the banking sector in Lebanon. But first and foremost, there's a political problem here, and maybe Ziad, you could talk through a little bit of the politics and also address whether, in a way, we expect too much of the IMF. I mean, is the IMF actually able to tackle these kinds of obstacles and resistance without the risk of being suspected of interference? And then I'd like to come to you, Reem, and ask whether, given the high debt burdens and their impact on economic growth and development, we've already heard a little bit about this from all three of you, where do you see these countries, those in particular that are in negotiation with the IMF or others, where do you see them in a few years from now? Is there a risk of default, for instance, in Egypt and Tunisia, the way we saw in Lebanon? So, and then I'm going to come back with the very specific question a little bit later to Niranjan about the impact of or potential benefits of the climate debt swap initiative that you've been working on. So I'd like first to come to Ziad about the politics, then Reem about the economics, if I may.
Sure. Well, to just address a specific point, I don't think at all that Egypt, at least, is in fear of default. It's not out of patriotism that I say so. I think, objectively speaking, it's not a country that's defaulted before. I think every effort is being put in avoiding a situation like this. And I think it ranks very high on the government's priorities to avoid such a situation. And I think that so far it's been managed, albeit at a high cost for the Egyptian people, but it's being managed. And I therefore have, I think, every reasonable sense to say that this is not a real, it's a significant risk, but I don't think it's one that will materialize at any point. Now, coming back to the IMF and the politics of the IMF, I think it's first of all important to recognize that although, of course, the IMF is a key part of the possible solution to the current situation, but it's not the only player. And therefore, in tackling the issue of debt, every country has to look at a number of measures, of counterparts, of policies to pursue that could lead to a resolution of this crisis, or at least a dampening of its impact. So IMF is key, of course, but relationship with the Gulf Cooperation Council countries is, I think, in my mind, the most crucial piece of this equation. Managing to encourage export, including tourism, at a time like this, especially following a big devaluation like the one we have had in Egypt, is also part of the equation. Managing to address the international community with a sensible and credible reform program, I think, is the most important part of this equation. Now, the IMF is part of this, of course. The IMF is not separate from an economic reform agenda. But I think it's important not to just look at the debt and the sustainability and the capacity to repay exclusively from the point from the angle of the IMF. Now, it's also important to recognize that the credibility of a reform program, in my opinion, is something that is not only required for the IMF, but it's required internally for the country itself. People need to feel that they are on a path of genuine economic reform. They need to be convinced that the future will look better than now. It's important for, as I said, GCC partners who have made it quite clear, at least in the case of Egypt, that there has to be real reform before money can be committed in the way that it used to be in the past. And it's important for the international debt markets in general. But the good thing is that once you have a credible and sensible and sustainable economic reform program, you begin to reap the benefits immediately. You don't need to wait until that program has come to fruition and has, kind of reached its end. It's the beginning of a reform program that brings some of the returns immediately. And that is why, whether with the IMF or otherwise, or as I said, your own internal population, the presentation of a sustainable and credible reform program is paramount. With IMF or without IMF is paramount. Now, of course, it's very helpful to have it in place with an IMF negotiation or an IMF review, but it's got to be the top priority for local consumption, for regional considerations, and of course for the international markets as well. Where we are now, you mentioned a few issues. You mentioned, for example, the role of the state or the military in the economy as being the issue with the IMF. It's a little bit more complex. I don't think that is the only factor. In fact, it may not be the prime factor anymore. I think currency. I think it's the currency market that is now the primary issue between Egypt and the IMF. Part of that too is the role of the state and the military economy. And the third component is the pace of the privatization program and whether it is sustainable. So it's not just one factor, and I suspect, again, in other countries in the region, it's probably a complex set of issues. That could be some that are more important at some other times. Right now, I think it's the currency issue that is withholding significant progress with the IMF.
Thank you. Okay, so over to you, Reem. How do you see this? Where do you take it?
Yeah, this is a very important question because, in fact, you have many moving targets currently. There is a debate to reform the international financial system architecture for the international financial institutions to take a bit more risk on their balance sheet. And also the debate about the channeling of the SDR. So it's all still in, I would say, movement. So we do not know how all of this will turn. And the second is looking at this, I would say, the sustained high debt burden for those countries. And I think any country that has very high debt stock, particularly when it's external debt, and they don't have the capability or the capacity or the revenue capacity to pay it back, then there is a problem. Because in reality, if we see the prospects of growth based on the current pillars of growth, if we are still relying on, for example, fossil fuel or other products that are derived from fossil fuel, then there is a problem, because we know very well that in the future the demand will decrease. So we need to go into more technologies, more innovations, and then more renewables. But this means also higher investments. So when the debt is domestic, then of course you have a little bit more leeway, but you have other problems, because then the issue there is you rely on your banking sector to finance your debt. And this is not good, because as I mentioned before, you have the crowding out effect for the private sector, and then with higher inflation, higher interest rates, I don't think it's sustainable at all in terms of economic development and developing new sectors and new technologies and new innovations. So in a way, you are trapped. These countries are trapped, economically trapped. So the governments, they only have to, of course, either increase taxation and then increase their efficiency to collect taxes. But then, if the prospects for the private sector development is abysmal, then it's a bit more complex there to find a way out. Increasing the public investment also difficult, because it means that they have to indebt themselves more. And then this is also something a little bit more complex, unless you have other sources of borrowing, and this could be from China, from India, from other players, or from the other partners or stakeholders. And this is also something that we need to watch out, because the majority of those, specifically China, for example, they don't adhere to transparency on borrowing, on lending. Sorry. So this is also increases in economic uncertainty, and it's not clear how those countries will be, in fact, resistant to further external shocks, because we know very well that there will be more frequency onto external shocks. Once, for example, the ones coming from the climate change, and we've seen it, for example, in terms of drought, in terms of everything. So looking at all of this, I only see more and more going forward reduced policy space and reduced capability of those governments to do much, and even to implement what I call the counter-cyclical fiscal policies to deal with economic downturns, and in fact escaping in a way from profound recessions. So now, in terms, of course, we have also the inflationary pressures that are still hanging around there, although we've seen some relaxation, but I think we will go back to the same, spiral. And this is not something that we will see evaporating very, very soon. So I see a problem of, in fact, debt overhang, and if there is no serious, I would say, decisive action from the international financial organizations to have, I would say, a deal with those countries to stabilize them and then to make their debt use more sustainable, I don't see how those countries really, with individual agreements with the IMF based on the logic of the IMF nowadays, without this reform, without these changes, without this increasing, I would say, risk-taking, and then take into account the long-term sustainability objectives that everybody would like to achieve and fast, I don't see a solution very much with the tools that we have, or the IMF or any other institution has nowadays.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, I'm going to work with that. All this that you're describing comes against a backdrop, of course, of climate change, which, among other things, means that ecosystems are being degraded in Middle Eastern and North African countries, further burdening, water supply, therefore agriculture, the quality of plants, the productivity of labor, degradation of soil and coasts, and so on, thereby further decreasing productivity of the economy and its surplus, if any, and therefore, of course, only increasing the need for various kinds of assistance or other sources of credit. And so it's a real vicious circle that is likely to intensify in the next few years. Before I come to Niranjan to tackle this, I just want to remind our audience that they can submit questions through the chat function. I also know that Reem will have to leave in a little while, so after Niranjan, I'm going to come back to you with a question to make sure that we get some more insight from you. But following the climate change theme. Niranjan, could you tell us more about the climate debt swap initiative and whether or not the International Monetary Fund is responding to this, and to what extent the countries we're looking at in the Middle East are actually able as well as willing to advance the initiative and take advantage of it?
Sure, thank you. And I think it's enjoying to hear the previous speakers. The last when Ms. Reem ended, and I would fully agree. Just to give a context to the Esquire debt swap initiative, that the debt problem, the debt overhang is going to stay unless there is some fundamental changes or fundamental considerations in addressing the debt burden of the countries, particularly when the interest rate is high. So cost of refinancing is high to pay back the debt, and stabilizing debt to GDP is one of the way forward that we also, I personally have written about it, and we are working out on modeling on evidence-based strategy, how countries can work out with that kind of strategy. Debt to GDP can be stabilized so that the countries can get some fiscal space in the medium term, and over time, if the amount of fiscal space that is generated, if it can be invested in productive channels that can help growth and generating revenues, and eventually it can provide a way forward. The other way option is what is a real instrument that can support reduction of debt. The current landscape is such that this space is not there actually. Either you go for debt restructuring, where the debtor countries are at the receiver end, they do not have a voice even in the debt resolution mechanism. The debt resolution mechanism is, as it stands, is inefficient, has not delivered as per the expectations or aspirations of countries. Many countries are going for issuing green bonds or sustainability linked bonds. They are discussing on how to issue sustainability linked bonds, which have a slightly lower rate of interest, but the cost of doing that is high. The preparedness is lacking. There are a significant number of areas where the countries need to improve their preparedness to structure those kind of instruments. Even then, they are debt generating instruments. So what is a way out of that if the external debt service is high? So the Esquire debt swap initiative is situated there. This instrument is we call it Climate SDGs Debt Swap Donor Nexus Initiative, which is like a debt swap initiative 0.2. It's not like the older one. Rather, we are looking at the initiative which can help, which helps preparing countries to develop a climate SDGs debt swap program. And this is structural. This is kind of this is the heart of it. If we have a good bankable project in a programmatic framework with a results-based approach, then the debt that can be rechanneled instead of debt servicing, if it can be rechanneled to that program, it generates growth and helps achieving the national priorities. So the focus is there should be this initiative has kind of 4 innovative features. One, that should be a national ownership, means the initiative supports countries to establish inter-ministerial task force and also consults with civil society so that a program is developed that achieves national priorities through the nationally determined contributions or other development plans. The initiative also advocates for scaling up the swap. The previous debt swaps, this I'm talking about bilateral debt swap between the debtor and the creditor. It's not just 1 year eligible debt swap, rather looking at the debt swap over a period of time. The debt services that would have been paid back to the creditor, if they can be rechanneled to these kind of investments, which is also in line with the Paris summit outcomes, that then take a period until 2030, for example, from 2024 to 2030. So that's a considerable amount of money, and that money can be invested in a series of projects in a programmatic framework. The other innovative feature is since this is a programmatic framework and the money comes from the national budgets, the primary mechanism is that the rechanneling of the debt services to this program, then it also provides a way out of policy reforms over the course, because the selection, monitoring, and assessment of the program, evaluation of the program is at the heart of it. So that delivers on the results. That's one of the features of it. Plus, if there is a credible program, then there is a element of a donor who have the common agenda of addressing climate change, of improving, of implementing the SDGs and Paris Agreement. So in that sense, the donor community can augment the amount of resources for this kind of climate SDGs debt swap program. At the heart of it lies, I mean, it's basically it can help both the donor and as well as the creditor and the debtor countries. The challenge lies in how the debtor countries develop the climate SDGs debt swap program, a bankable projects, which is result oriented, and that's one of the challenges we see. And on the creditors side, of course, there should be more appetite and more support for this kind of long-term and multi-year swaps. In the region, there is quite interest, responding to your question on how it is taken in the region. We have piloted with Jordan. We are also initiating work with Tunisia, and we are also discussing with Egypt. All the three countries are very much interested in engaging with this program. So also we have some interest from the creditors side. Some creditors side, and also IMF, since you talked about IMF and the Bretton Woods institutions, which are slowly converging on it toward considering swap as a viable instrument. A swap in the sense that bilateral debt swaps. The debt swaps can also be other type, like we have seen the commercial debt swaps in Belize or in Ecuador or in Barbados. So that is another kind of swap. But this particular climate SDGs debt swap is, if I summarize, it exists now, and these countries have done the swaps with the bilateral creditors, but they were done in an ad hoc manner. But we are trying to see how these kind of exchanges can be more institutionalized, and they can be scaled up in a way that can support accelerating the climate action and achieving the SDGs. So this is in a nutshell. I'll be happy to take up questions on this. Thank you. But just to if you allow me 1 second, is that it's one of the solutions to address the debt challenge. This is definitely not the solution to address the debt challenge, but this is one of the solutions which is debt reductionary than the other solutions.
Absolutely. I was, in fact, going to pick up on that. I mean, and take us back to the bigger picture of this sort of immense complexity that every speaker so far on this panel has underlined. And it's very difficult. We can see balancing and navigating through all these complex challenges. And so, Reem, I want to give you a chance to get away if you need before we end. I'm going to come immediately to you with a question about what you see as the necessary adjustments in how the international financial institutions, including the Bretton Woods pair, what do they need to do to adjust in how they work to adapt to these complex realities? I mean, otherwise, is there a way out of the debt crisis for them?
Yeah, I think there is the whole debate now about how to make those institutions a little bit more inclusive, and then better understand really the global realities, and then giving a bit more, I would say to the global South overall. I think this is one aspect which, in fact, make what I call the role more equitable in a way, because any country at a point in time of its cycles, they might have difficulties. So I think treatments, in my view, that are based on strict conditionality need to be revisited. And instead of conditionality, in my view, we should devise a system that is much more transparent. So transparency. So really trying to trade, I would call, in a way, this conditionality, which are sometimes very hard, austere measures. Yes, they might be, a hard way to do things. But then, in my view, if you make things much more transparent, it might also serve that purpose, particularly because then you make the citizens more accountable. And I think this is what you want, Yuma. You really want like to have citizens much more accountable. Now, this is on the functioning overall, but I think we also need to give more role to the private sector. I think nowadays private sector involvement is key, because all these countries, you look at the structure of the external debt, it's not only owned by, or the creditors, not only the IMF or the World Bank or the bilateral creditors of Paris Club. It is also the private sector, the investment funds and firms and banks who have granted loans to those countries. So they have to have a part of the discussion proactively, because they are also part of the market and they could also discipline those countries. Of course, again, transparency and appropriate oversight. I think this is also important to keep in mind. Also, we cannot disconnect, the short-term priorities with the long-term priorities and all these sustainable development goals and post-sustainable development goals, because we are SDGs are 2030. We are almost there in 2030, and in fact, nothing has, very little has been achieved. So we need to move into 2050, but then we cannot keep the same SDGs from 2030 to 2050, because this is a big failure globally. So we need to go to post SDGs, and this has costs also. This is also important. So at least my take about this is first to have a global stabilizer and for all the countries that are suffering from debt issues because of what has happened in the past. So they could be eventually the restructured, but then not restructured without the discussions with the private sector, because then you increase on them the cost of refinancing in the market. So this is also not something that we would like. And then second, it also to use guarantees or counter guarantees from those international organizations that can give long-term guarantees to reduce the cost of financing and to give much more, I would say, overall coherence and developing this framework, private-public partnership framework, which in fact is anchored into transparency. And also, I think the IMF has the tools, but then they are not using it to their full potential. And this is the RST, which is the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. So this Resilience and Sustainability Trust could, in fact, be enhanced via the SDR channeling mechanisms, and then provide guarantees to up to 60%, and then agree with a certain rate to refinance or to restructure in a way all the debt burden or the debt piles of those countries. And then in the future, the money that is borrowed could serve for sustainable development goals. And this is monitored transparently with the appropriate mechanisms and registration also. So then everything is clear to everybody, not only to the governments themselves and to the international organizations, but also to researchers, to whoever in the market who is monitoring and looking at those at those loans and whatever. So this is what I think, at least my opinion, should be. So really foster transparency in this in this field, and at the same time use of guarantees, long-term guarantees, first for stabilization, economic stabilization, and second for sustainability, and also for changing the economies into I would say post SDGs.
Thank you. So Ziad Bahaa-El Din, I'm coming to you now, following on that, but diving in a little a bit with one or two things. I mean, clearly, we're living in a moment of global political and economic change in where power is centered and or diffused and distributed. And of course, all that also we see impacting negotiations about credit and borrowing and so on in the Middle East, about who local countries turn to. And one interesting thing that struck me was the recent deal between Egypt and the Emirates about a debt swap. Egypt has previously done that with China, foreign exchange debt swap. So I guess I'm interested in some of the angles, some of the dimensions of this. Do you see debt swaps of this kind as particularly useful, or are they just a minor element? And on the other side, domestically, clearly there's a need for dialogue. I mean, one of the problems in quite a few Middle East countries, and this is something that Ayadi was just bringing out, is the failure to mobilize private resources, whether it's the private sector, or if you wish, civil society more broadly, in terms of thinking through policy as well as in terms of providing investment. And so, what is the scope for national dialogue to help think about the political, social, and economic dimensions of reform? So you might want to take this in any way you like. Really, it's an open-ended question for you.
Sure. No, the swaps. First of all, the swaps are important. They're a good tool to use, especially in times of credit and foreign currency shortages, and I think they're being well perceived here in Egypt, and I certainly would be happy to see them grow. But that's not the solution. These are, as I said, just tools to manage very specific needs, but they're not really the long-term solution that will get us out of the crisis, nor alleviate our debt burden. To me personally, and I'll try to put all of your kind of various angles, it's investment that counts. It's private sector investment that is the cornerstone of everything that we talk about. And the truth is that there has not been a very easy investment environment facing investors in Egypt in the last few years. And I mean by that both foreign investors as well as local investors. And in fact, it's your local investors who need to be comfortable and reassured and safe in order for a country to attract foreign investors. Now, I think this is the one thing that we need to put most of our attention on. We will continue to be part of global and regional groups. We will continue to borrow from markets that are available, but I think it's investment that has to be the driver behind setting the priorities also for dealing internationally as well as regionally. And here I want to say that there has been in recent months a much bigger attention given to investment. There's been some dialogue going on about investment, how to improve it, what measures, what laws, what regulations, what initiatives. But it's extremely important to use part of the investment literature is the idea of whether you will be racing to the bottom or racing to the top. It's not good enough to attract investment simply by offering to reduce your taxation, reduce your barriers, reduce your restrictions that are legitimate. It's very important to attract investment by improving who you are rather than by lowering standards. And that's what's called in investment literature racing to the top or racing to the bottom. We have to be very conscious that as much as we do need to attract investment, it's got to be a fine balance between what you offer and what you forego. And therefore, the race to the top must continue to be present in our minds. And finally, just to say that, consider this a bit old-fashioned, but I don't deal with Arab investment as just part of international investment. I think Arab investment within the Arab region, from any country to any country, is of a different nature. It is investment that has always shown itself to be more durable, more long-term, more resilient, much more widespread in various industries. And therefore, I cannot treat Arab investment as investment coming from anywhere else. I think top priority should be given to enter Arab investment. It's a subject we've talked about for tens of years, probably. But some ideas are just, maybe their time has come now. And I think in the current economic crises that are around the world and moreover in our region, I think it's time to bring up a serious discussion about the parameters and the incentives at what would make inter-Arab investment really become the driver for growth in the next years to come. Yazid, you're muted, by the way. You've been muted since I finished.
I'm sorry, I did actually click on it and it didn't work. I'm just saying you brought us back full circle, really, very nicely. And I'm reminded of the plan adopted by the League of Arab States in 1980 for a decade of development, which in a way basically embodied many of these ideas. And I'm just hoping that this time around we've got a better chance of our governments actually implementing this kind of approach. Obviously, it's a far more complex situation we're now looking at. And in some cases, the challenges are far more serious, but also maybe some of the opportunities and the motivations to do things differently might finally win out. I'm going to come finally with a final question to Niranjan. I'll just note for our audience that we've had some questions which I've already woven into the questions that I've put to our panelists. And so I will now come to you with what is the final question, after which we'll wrap. We'll switch off, and that is, could I ask you to think concretely about the extent to which you think the International Monetary Fund should rethink the design and management of conditionality? This is something that Reem Ayadi commented on and endorsed several times today. Does conditionality need to adapt to new types of development challenges that Arab countries face, that are, in other words, policies that are socially acceptable, that are long-term, as Ziad Bahaa-El Din was just saying, that involve inclusive development, adaptation to climate change, and energy transition in particular? How to rethink this design? What must the IMF do, do you think?
Thank you for the question, and I think yes, it has been an engaging discussion. I would see it in not just an IMF; it's the whole issue of international financing architecture. If there is a significant amount of resources or part of revenues is going for debt service and it's going for external debt service, it's a leakage, and obviously that reduces the envelope for investing in either climate action or any other productive investment. So obviously, capital spending in the Arab region has been going down, if you look at it over the past decade or more than that. Similarly, if the debt burden is high and the cost of borrowing refinancing is high, it risks the debt service to snowball. And obviously, that's again another situation where if IMF and the country agrees that we have to reduce the debt to GDP by a certain threshold in a certain period, obviously it doesn't provide any scope for investment or for finances that is required by the developing countries to grow, not to reduce expenditure. So how to enhance fiscal spending for growth generated, which is growth generating, which is socially inclusive, which supports social spending, that's a big challenge. And that's where the international financing architecture needs reforms. United Nations Secretary General policy briefs on SDG stimulus as well as international financing architecture reform sheds light on that. I would highlight just 4 points, given the time constraint. I'll just highlight four key points. First, countries definitely need SDG stimulus. SDG in the sense that it covers the whole, for growth, for social finance, and all that. And that has been discussed in the Paris summit, in the previous World Bank IMF meeting in April. It's about how to rechannel the SDRs, a new issue of SDRs. the previous new issue of SDR was not enough to address the financing gap. So, but unfortunately, that's not much has been done about it. The credit enhancement is one of the issues which there has been some successes in certain countries, particularly those which have gone for debt restructuring. But that's again a kind of distress used in the case of distress situation of the countries who do not have an option, but they have defaulted or are at the very high risk of default. Countries who are not considering default, or countries who are paying back the debt, they are facing the heat of fiscal space, how to spend it. For them, they need also longer term or concessional borrowing over the longer term. So this is a big issue that is discussed, how to refinance MDBs so that they revert the trend of concessional financing, how to increase concessional financing to the developing countries, particularly at this juncture, and how the discussion will emerge in the Marrakech. We will see that what kind of support that MDBs can provide, particularly MDBs can provide to revert the trend of concessional finance, and which is a key resource for the developing countries, particularly when the pocket of revenues from the taxation is low, and it cannot be improved in short term. So obviously, you need immediate finance to invest in climate action and other social financing. Third, I would say that whatever is done is not enough in terms of financing. So they will definitely need more debt finance in terms of green bonds or in terms of other kind of sustainability linked bonds. But that's where they need to innovate also the instruments that are debt reductionary, such as debt swaps, how they can be more scaled up, how they can be institutionalized, how a concrete program can be used. The debt swap proceeds can use to finance the concrete programs that deliver results, because we also discussed about governance, transparency, monitoring and evaluation, so that way the result is delivered with the debt. Connecting debt to development is key there. And finally, I would also say that addressing structural challenge is important, and that brings back to the point that Dr. Ziad was mentioning in the beginning, and that's where fundamental structural change in looking at debt sustainability assessment is key. For the developing countries, we have done research, we have also advocating this point that reducing debt to GDP as IMF conditionality to a particular threshold is not going to help countries. Rather, it is going to deteriorate. Private finance, private investment has not come back. If that has been the aspiration of finance ministers in the region, but it is not paying back. So public resource is a key resource for development, and for that there should be some space how to stabilize debt to GDP over the medium term, how to do the debt in evidence-based strategy that they do achieve debt sustainability. At the same time, they have some fiscal space for social spending, for investment to generate growth. So IMF is at the helm of it. The other Bretton Woods institutions are the helm of this, redesigning, reforming the financial architecture. I think everybody has a stake on it, and we look forward to the discussions in Marrakech, what can come from out of it.
Many thanks. And at this point, it's time to wrap up. I want to express my deep appreciation, gratitude to our panelists, Dr. Ziad Bahaa-El Din, Dr. Niranjan Sarangi, and Dr. Reem Ayadi. And also to thank the audience for joining us. Thanks for your questions. I'm Yazid Sair of the Malcolm H. Kerr Middle East Center in Beirut, Lebanon. And I look forward to seeing you on Zoom, online, other platforms, in coming events. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.